You know, you just mentioned, by the way, Rhonda, that you know, recycle, that it would be in a self-contained system. Are there regulations that require it to be in a self-contained system, or is it something that is self-regulated?
I think you're constantly moving towards both new best practices in the industry. To give you an example, even hydraulic fracturing, obviously water has been a big concern. We're looking at technologies now that would be foam. So you do have regulations that are going to regulate that.
Absolutely.
Okay, as a matter of fact, recycling is not required under Ohio law, even though Rhonda says the industry is moving toward it. It is done by some companies, but it's not required. And also the produced water, that she talked about, that has to be, and she's correct, it has to be put into Class 2 injection wells. Well, we've seen from Youngstown that Class 2 injection wells have their own set of problems.
We've got plenty of questions on water as well. I just want to keep moving forward. There's a question specifically about Mr. Mannion's well. I don't know what either one of you know about that, or if either one of you will verse on it to give an answer. Well, I prefer not to go that route. The Granger Township, I mean, the only reason I say that is, are you familiar with what I'm talking about, any of you four? Well, when I say familiar, I mean functionally knowledgeable to come up here and speak with some, you know, and I don't mean that in an insult in any way, but it's one thing, I've heard rumors, but I always tell people I heard, you know, I said that I heard that girls would kiss her and I kissed her and it wasn't so. All right, that's right. The question is, can you address the issue? It's a real open-ended question. I'm going to move on. I just wanted to. Yeah, I'm going to move on anyway because it's a real open-ended question. I think it would take time because there's always technological and scientific issues that are really at play that are specific to his property that may or may not have to do with the industry. Where is all the oil and gas going to be used?
Everywhere, anywhere, all over the place.
I think it's a big question. I think it's a fair question. A lot of people are saying, they're going to say, okay, so we've got these shale plays being developed all over the United States, actually worldwide. And here in Ohio, we currently only produce enough natural gas to supply about 20% of our current energy needs. Ohio is the 4th largest consuming state of natural gas. 7 out of every 10 homes uses natural gas, including propane. And so the neat thing about what we're going to produce here is a lot of that is going to stay right here in our own backyard. On the crude oil side, I know that here in Ohio, we are down to 2 refineries only that buy Ohio crude oil. We haven't built a new refinery in this country in over 40 years. So there is a concern about refinery capacity that I think people are trying to address.
In my understanding is the oil industry, that's one of the biggest limiting factors currently, right? Okay. Go ahead, Robert. Just speak up and say, can I go?
This is just information that I have observed of recent. The natural gas that is being extracted currently is now going to be put in liquid form, and they're going to store it in liquid natural gas form. Okay, there are 11 of these sites in the United States currently. 2 of them, of these liquid natural gas storage areas, are allowed to export to other countries. So, with this in mind, the Chinese and the Koreans will pay anywhere around $15 to $18 a BTU What is a BTU? It stands for British Thermal Unit. We currently, our level that we pay currently in the United States, it's a little over $2 it's currently trading at right now. Would you let me finish, please? So, if we're currently at $2 a BTU, and the Chinese and the Koreans are willing to pay $18, they're going to ship that stuff out of our state and throughout the country. It's not going to stay here in the United States.
Well, to again, try to ask them not to engage, I was going to ask the question, Robin, and the question I was going to ask somewhat related to that is, what's wrong with that?
Well, I have a problem with the fact of what we are giving up as far as extracting it from our state, okay? The risks that we are going to be exposed to with our air,
I know
our
that's
water,
a separate issue.
and our
My
land.
question is if we're talking about just strictly about where it actually goes, if another country is willing to pay 9 times what we pay in our own country, what's wrong with that?
I have a problem with that because all the propaganda in the media is geared currently towards that we need to be energy independent, okay? So if you go ahead and take our supplies, now keep in mind, this oil is not going to last, or this gas is not going to last 100 years, how they try to portray it. It may last 14 years, okay? So once we spin through that cycle of supplies, okay, we go ahead and sell it to the highest bidder, okay? Then where's that going to leave us, okay?
Everything you're saying is totally false.
And
No, it's not false.
Hey, hold up. Let's not get there. This is the whole thing. It's all right. Each person can make up their own decision whether they think it is or not.
Currently, they are going to try, and Congress, and they're trying to get legislation currently changed, where they are going to change the liquid natural gas tanks that they currently have. They have 11 of them, like I said, and there's only 2 that are allowed to export. Not last week, I was just talking about it, last week, Blackstone just gave $2 billion to one of these sites, okay? $2 billion, all right? And this particular site is going to export that oil to other countries. And I have a problem with it. It needs to stay in this country. It's our oil and gas. It needs to stay here.
Hey, let's stay out there. The whole point is that's her position, that's her opinion. We'll move on. All right? You don't have to agree or disagree. We're going to move on. All right? There's a question here that's much more generalized. I'm just going to, the question's about a semi-tanker having fluid in it that crashes and it goes in the yard, and how dangerous is, the water that comes out of the fracking sites. I think really the question is, if somebody were to have those, that water on their property, how harmful would it be to their kids or their families? That's the real question.
Well, the only way I can answer that is, since 1953, we have hydraulically fractured 80,000 wells in the state, and we have never had a single case of groundwater contamination dealing with hydraulic fracturing or any hydraulic fracturing fluid. So that's a hypothetical question.
Well, no,
And I don't want to get trapped into one of
the
those.
question's actually, it's not the hypothetical in that regard. It's actually the water that's used for the injection well, for the well itself, right? That's removed. For one, just one well. And we're not talking about the contamination of the groundwater. We're talking about it, let's just hypothetically say, and I'm saying it, I know that you want to, if I were to go in there and that water was to get into my property, into my garden, because a tanker spilled, what kind of impact does that have?
Are we talking brine now?
Whatever you remove from the site and put in a tanker.
Again, we produce a lot of brine, salt water, or sometimes it's referred to as oil field waste because Ohio was covered by ocean at one time. I think that everybody will recognize that the United States, we've come a long way in our environmental laws. Today, and again, House Bill 501, back in the 80s, stated that you can no longer discharge brine into lakes or streams. We knew that it obviously was causing damage. These are good environmental laws. States like Pennsylvania are just now coming into compliance. And again, it gives you an idea how far advanced Ohio has always been when it comes to our environmental laws. And that's why obviously it was causing maybe some grass to die, you know.
And brine is basically, it's the salt that goes into water. We talk about brackish water, estuarial streams. That's where it meets the salt water, meets the fresh water. And generally what she's talking about is the salt that comes out of it is in the water. And my understanding is what you're saying is the water that's actually being transported. The problem is the salt that's contained in that water as much as the chemicals. Is that what you're telling me? All right, do you have a, okay. I guess so.
I wouldn't know what to tell you if that happened, because the natural gas corporations don't disclose all the chemicals they use to any of us. So I don't know what all kinds of chemicals would be included in that, because to my knowledge, that's not given to people when they come onto your land. So I don't know what that would be.
All right. I have a non-controversial question here. It's to Ron Prosek. What is the website where you can check status of wells under construction? Yep.
I thought you were going to ask for information on fracking. Well, if you're talking about wells under construction, you can go to the ODNR website. And I'm sure Ron would tell you the same, right?
Yeah, that's fine. It is what it is.
Let's build on that.
All right, this is a question, it says to Rhonda. I actually want to put it to both sides because there's been a lot of questions about it causing earthquakes. What data is out there to support or to suggest that? What case studies, what's there to suggest that horizontal fracturing causes earthquakes? It just says earthquakes.
I have a slide on earthquakes. Could I throw up one slide?
If you can do it quickly, sure.
And there hasn't been any correlation between hydraulic fracturing, even if the well's been horizontally drilled, and to the earthquakes. I think the question really has to do with the Youngstown well, and the question is whether or not the injection wells have caused any earthquake. And this gives you an idea of where all the 181 injection wells are here in Ohio. And that gives you an idea of where in Ohio we had over 400 earthquakes last year. Worldwide, we had about 1.3 million earthquakes. I think it was the right thing to do to take a look at that disposal well in Youngstown. Most disposal wells are old oil and gas producing wells, and so they have very good cross-view permeability. That's how we got oil and gas out in the first place. So it's a way to take an old producing well and still make it economical. The particular well in question was actually drilled as an injection well. And the question is, they want to make sure that it was drilled into a porous rock formation. And so there is a lot of coincidence, but still I think that ODNR did the right thing to shut down that injection well until they could properly investigate those geological formations. Still, we got, again, we've had injection wells since the mid-'80s, but again, I think it was the right thing to do.
Okay, my response would be, in terms of Youngstown, which is where these occurred, we all heard about the earthquake on December 31st, the largest earthquake, 4.0. But before that, there were 10 earthquakes in that same area over about a 8 or 9 month period. I think it was from March, so maybe that was a 10-month period. So about 10 earthquakes in that period. And this was the strongest one, and there was actually one after that. But what they had done before the large earthquake on December 31st, They had set up seismographs in the area because of the previous earthquakes. And when the last earthquake occurred, they pretty much pinpointed it, the epicenter to be at where the the injection well was. And this is a report that was done, this was a study that was done by Cornell University. And in that report, they said the most likely cause was the injection well. And they explained it by saying that it lubricated some of the geology underground and caused slippage. This was actually known to have occurred also in Ashtabula County in the 1980s. There was some fluid injection that caused an earthquake in that region as well. So the possibility of earthquakes is not totally unknown. Dr. James Northrop, who is a driller actually, drilled offshore and onshore, and he's now a critic of the industry. But he pointed out that in Texas, where he's from, the geology is very well known because, you know, drilling has been going on there forever. But he said in the eastern states, like New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, the geology is not quite as well known. We've had vertical wells in Ohio, but we haven't had these massive wells where we're drilling deeper. So, you know, they're looking at this more closely, and I agree with Rhonda. It was the wisest thing to do, obviously, to stop these injection wells. But this is going to be the Achilles heel of shale drilling, because if we find out that we cannot dispose of the produced water through Class 2 injection wells, you know, there really isn't much other way to do it. We can't go back to dumping them in rivers like they did in Pennsylvania, or putting them through treatment plants.
Ron, why have you then? On that topic, if we talked about recycling or a self-contained system that recycled used water, would you think that that would be a step towards a solution for what you just talked about?
Well, so, as I said, some of the industry are doing recycling. They would like to recycle because it saves them money when they can, but they can't always do that. As I said, looking at the track record, they haven't always done it and are not always doing it. But I think in the end, I really think that we're kind of going down a blind alley. I think it's not that we're dependent on foreign oil. It's that we're dependent on oil and gas to the extent we are. We need to move much more into green energy. The only reason we haven't moved farther into green energy, it's not because of technological reasons, it's political reasons. The oil and gas industry is the most powerful lobby in the United States and in Ohio, and they have made sure that green energy has been blocked. They get tens of millions of dollars in subsidies every year, which they do not need.
I do have one more question. I'll let you respond. Ron, my understanding is that a portion of the money that's taken from the severance tax is supposed to be used for alternative energy development. That's my understanding.
That may be true, but it's a drop in the bucket. And when you look at the amount of money that is being put into petroleum compared to green energy, it's really laughable. We're 20 years behind where we should be. Look at some of these countries in Europe. They're way ahead of us in green energy. And actually, we could outperform them because the United States really has the ability second to none. We're just not using it.
All right, I asked a lot of questions, Ronnie. There's a lot of things there. You can comment on any, all, the above, whatever.
Well, the subsidies, I'd like to know of one oil and gas company here in the state of Ohio that takes a subsidy. Name one. Name one across the United States that does subsidies. One.
What about the 1.4 billion jobs Ohio that takes it right now, where you guys are going to access this money? Go ahead.
I think the question was about subsidies.
It is a subsidy right here.
Jobs Ohio is a subsidy.
It is a subsidy. It's corporate welfare.
Jobs Ohio is trying to bring jobs and economic development to the state of Ohio. Okay, first of all, on the subsidies, the oil and gas industry does not take subsidies. Now, I know of no producers, and there's several here, we don't get subsidies. If you go out and you drill a well, I don't care if you spend $1 million on it or $10 million on it. If it's a dry hole, it's a dry hole. Okay, nobody offsets that money. Okay, so there are no subsidies involved. And that's probably the big one that I wanted to address. And on the water side, again, on the recycling, what you're talking about is the flowback, and that is on the hydraulic fracturing. Separate from that is the produced water that naturally comes out of the ground, which is the brine or salt water. We are not yet there. Someday, maybe someone will like bottled salt water. We're not there yet, but I think as technology changes, we will be able to somehow be able to process that. And I think we're moving that way in so many different things. But there's two different waters.
This may seem like a smart aleck question, but if it's just small salt water, how come I can't dump it in the middle of the Atlantic? I mean, I'm asking a serious question.
I don't know, maybe you could. I know it's, and I'm not a chemist, and I think I would probably defer that because I know that regular salt water in the ocean, I mean, keep in mind, this has been underground. There's different things that have long over time been combined in that. So you're not talking apples to apples.
That answers the question. It's not simply just salt water, and that's just to go through. In any geological formation, you have a lot of other chemicals and properties, and there are things there under our ground that are there every place. So the question I asked, I wasn't trying to be smart to her. I was just saying that if it is simply salt water, you'd be able to think you could just drop it in the Atlantic. The thing is, and each time you dig, it's going to be different from one area to the next because the chemicals that come out would be different based on the geological formations. All right, there's a question that goes to Steve. There's a few questions. And Steve, the questions generally have to do with this. What were the negative impacts in Pennsylvania on people and families? More specifically, how did it affect their water, their farms, and their ability to eat nutritional meals and survive and thrive?
Guess you have to answer it when it's directed right at you. The nutrition part, I have no idea, but what we experienced in Pennsylvania, Dimmock specifically, was contamination of well water in eastern Pennsylvania that affected around 19 families where they could no longer use their well water as a primary source of drinking water. That meant that they needed to receive another source of drinking water. The industry had supplied them through a DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, through a consent order that they had to supply them with a water buffalo or an alternative means for drinking water. We've also seen instances in western Pennsylvania where people's well water supplies have been contaminated as well out that way. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly what the ramifications were other than the industry wound up buying the property back off of them because they could no longer use it anymore. The details of the case that they used legally is sealed, so you don't have actual details of it. I've also heard of people who have lived near compressor stations in western Pennsylvania who have experienced respiratory problems, have experienced nosebleeds from consistent exposure to it, especially if you're living in an area where you're receiving wind that's blowing it directly towards your place. And I think part of all this really stems from the fact that the setbacks for drilling industry are, in my opinion, way too close to people's homes and water supplies. If we increase that type of setback, we run the risk. We run a risk that there is less contamination of people's well water. There is less a risk that they're exposed directly towards any type of air pollution that comes off of this industry.
Good.
Real quick, and obviously to talk about it, Dimmock or something, I mean, that's a tough situation. That's why it's important, particularly here in Ohio, that we have good well construction rules, make sure that those are implemented and followed up, and make sure that the ODNR folks are out there checking that cement, checking that casing, to make sure that those type of things in PA, whatever that situation may be, may not happen here in Ohio. And there's another piece of that too, and that, Mark, I appreciate your laughter, but I also think that it's about the leasing as well too. Make sure if you are going to lease your land, that you have a strong lease so that both the company and the landowner understand what the rights and responsibilities are, and get your water tested. Make sure that your water is tested so that you understand exactly what is in it prior to anything happening. Even if you didn't lease your water, it's always good to have that done as well too. So I think there are multiple parts there, but there are lessons that we can learn from other states and implement them here in Ohio. And that's why Senate Bill 165 was so important, to make sure that those well construction rules were codified and actually put in there so we understand exactly what our responsibilities are to protect those waters. You make an excellent point, absolutely.
There's a question here, and I don't really understand it, so this is outside the scope of something that I understand. It says, what is the allowable amount of LEL in your well water? I don't know what LEL is.
I wish Mark could come up here and speak to that, but he can't. But LEL refers to the explosive level of gas that might be in any area. And I don't know if there's an allowable level. I think it's 0, isn't it? Yeah, 0. He cannot. So it's 0. You don't want explosive stuff around your house. And that's how people have been affected. I mean, talking about people being affected, that's how the people in Bainbridge Township were affected. Their house was blown off the foundation. I talked to those folks that survived that. I mean, these people were in their 80s. This is not the kind of thing they needed to go through in their 80s. And 40 water wells were ruined. I remember I went to a meeting there at the police station, community meeting, and I was thirsty. I went to the drinking fountain and pushed the button. I thought, duh, I forgot, they don't have a well either. So, I mean, that whole community was impacted. But the people that lived there were very heavily impacted. They had to wait for more than 2 years to get their water replaced. They had to do all kinds of makeshift things to have water for 2 years.
All right, there's a lot of different questions. One of them I'll try to streamline.